Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan, this is Super Review, and about a week, almost 2 weeks ago, I got this. This is the Fiio FD5. It's Fio's latest earphone, kind of a premium priced single dynamic driver. Just on that price, the FD5 is a $300 to $320 priced IM, kind of depending on where you find it. And for that, you get, well, like I mentioned, you get a single dynamic driver, which might not sound like a lot, but compared to some other IMs that Fiio makes, you know, the FD1 as well as like the FH3, I looked into those. Those use 10mm dynamic drivers in addition to balanced armatures for the FH3, but what we got here is actually a 12mm dynamic driver, so 20% bigger than what you'll find in some of their lower priced IMs. But like those IMs, the dynamic driver in here is beryllium coated if, again, you're particular about your metal coatings. I know a lot of people make a lot to do of beryllium coatings, think that it's good for bass, and as we'll get into when we talk about the sound of this earphone, it's definitely a bass heavy earphone. But yeah, so I've been spending the past week and a half, almost 2 weeks listening to this, comparing it to some other IMs that I've got in this price range. The main things I was comparing this to were the recently released Moondrop Cross Critical Blessing 2 Dusk, as well as the FD01 by JVC. And I also compared it a little bit with Fio's own FH3, which again, we'll get into the details of that. But yeah, that's this earphone. Let's go ahead and talk about the build quality, and then we'll get into talking about the sound, and I'll give it a review score. And at the end of that, I'll have a little conversation with the folks that are here in the live stream. And if you're watching this and it's not live, you missed out, but that's cool. You can subscribe to the channel, ding the bell, and then the next time I'm live, YouTube will let you know. Then we can have a little chat. But for now, let's go ahead and talk about the Fiio FD5, which I think just kind of right off the bat, I don't know if there's going to be many people out there that disagree with me. This is a very pretty earphone. Oh, well, actually, you know what? Let's quick talk about what you get inside the box of it, just in case you missed the unboxing video. For its price, 320 bucks, you actually do get a pretty good spread of stuff, which is not surprising. Fiio is usually pretty good about that. So you do get this nice little carrying case. It's got a magnetic clasp on it, which is cool. You get a MMCX disconnector, which is a nice little thing to throw in there. Frankly, I actually didn't even use it. I'm pretty good at MMCX cables. I don't want to brag, but if you have trouble with MMCX cables, I think those little pliers will probably help you out. Anyway, you get that, you get a host of ear tips, and I just ruined my display. But yeah, you get tons of ear tips, including, let's see, you get memory foam, you get balance set, you get triple flange, you get bass ear tips, and you get vocal ear tips. For my listening, I pretty much just stuck with the balanced ear tips. There you go. As kind of, I'm over here struggling to get these things lined up well. What this is, and we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about the cable. But basically the cable, you can swap the tips or the terminations, which is a really cool touch. And then you also get a set of screw-on nozzles. So you can swap out the nozzles of this earphone, change up the sound. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail in a bit. But let's go ahead and go back to the earphone itself, because man, I really like looking at this thing. I think it's pretty nice. It is a very solid, fairly hefty chunk of stainless steel. All right, I assume it's stainless steel. Let's go ahead and take off the tip so you can take a look at the nozzle. You know, it's got its pretty typical build in terms of the nozzle construction, although it is a nice metal nozzle. And it's got a little bit of a tip with some knurling on it, so I had no issues at all with these ear tips staying in place, which is good. And yeah, generally I think that the build quality of the IMs itself is actually pretty nice. Again, they're a little bit on the hefty side, but they're not too heavy. I would say that they're probably about on par, maybe a little bit heavier than something like the JVC FD5. But because this cable has got the preformed ear hooks, I actually found that in my ear and just wearing it, it felt a little bit lighter, or just it didn't feel as heavy as the JVCs. Then the cable, let's go ahead and show this cable real quick. It's a pretty decent little cable, like it looks nice. I have a little bit of issue with it, you know, just having some memory of its shape. You can kind of see It's trying to kind of wind itself up a little bit. It's a little bit on the kinky side, but for the most part, a pretty well behaved cable. You can see here, it's a little bit stiff, which just means that like it's popping up. Not a bad cable by any stretch, but I don't know, probably not my favorite cable. That said, it does have a pretty cool party trick, and I'll try and demonstrate that now, which is these swappable terminations. So it was cool that Dunu kind of started doing this, and it's nice to see other companies like Fiio picking up on it. But basically, most of the time when you buy an earphone, it's going to come with a standard 3.5 millimeter connection. And if you want to use that earphone on a balanced source, right, you're going to have to either choose, well, one, you're probably going to have to buy a separate cable, but then you're also going to have to choose between 4.4 millimeter or 2.4 millimeter balanced. What's cool about what Fiio and Dunu are doing is that they give you kind of all the options at once. So here Fiio has supplied a 4.4 millimeter and a 2.4 millimeter balanced terminations. And then if we go here to this end, basically what you do is you just unscrew the bottom, and then you have to pull pretty firmly. I gotta be honest, like I'm not a big fan of this mechanism because you do have to pull pretty hard. And when you're doing that, make sure you're not holding it by the cable. Try to hold it as much as you can down here, although you can see because of this sleeve, there's not a whole lot of room to hold on there anyway. But you are able to pull this thing out, and it's got like a little 4-pin sort of mechanism in here that you got to line up with the 4 pins inside here. And then let's see if I can, yeah, there's a little dot inside there that will basically force you to line this up the correct direction, plug it back in, and then screw it back together, and you've got whichever termination you want. I think that's a nice touch. Let's talk a little bit about comfort with the FD5. So fit-wise, I mean, you might have seen in the close-ups there that the nozzles on these things are not the longest. And I find that fit-wise, it fits me pretty decent, but I do have to somewhat frequently readjust them in my ears. They just don't lock in super well. But comfort, I have zero problem. I was able to sleep through nights with these things in my ear, and you know, even lying my head on the side. There's no hard pressure points or anything like that, but it was just more about the security, and maybe that's the sort of thing that I could probably dial in with a little bit of more ear tip swapping, but for the most part, I just stuck with the stock tips. Actually, on that note, let's talk a little bit about these swappable nozzles, and I'm not going to go ahead and demonstrate the nozzle swapping mechanism just because it's a little tedious. They're basically just screw in, screw out. It's not too hard. But what's interesting about these nozzles is that if you use these nozzles, not only do they slightly change the sound profile of the FD5, but these are actually narrower nozzles than the nozzles that are pre-installed here. And if you use these, you actually have to use Fio's supplied 3-flange tips. So if you don't like a deep fit, well, you're not going to want to use these nozzles. And I'm fine with etymotic fit, but just as kind of like here's a picture of what the Fiio looks like with those longer nozzles and the 3-flange tips on it. It's a bit memey. I don't think with this fit, you're not going to have any issues with security, but I personally didn't really like the way that it sounded that way, so I did not use it that way for very long. Anything else I should talk about the build of this thing? I don't think so. I mean, just generally, I think it's, you know, a very nice looking earphone. Fit-wise and ergonomics are not the best, but it's not bad at all. Yeah, I don't know. Frankly, I find that most single dynamic driver earphones, especially ones that kind of come in this shape, just aren't the best fitting, whereas a balanced armature set usually, commonly will come in a shell that's a little bit more fitted to the ear. So yeah, that is the build of the FD5. Let's go ahead and talk about now the sound. And just kind of up front, the general sound signature of the FD5 is, as I alluded to, fairly bassy. This is a fairly warm, bassy, V-shaped IM. You kind of saw that during my unboxing. I did a frequency response graph of it. And you see that it's got a lot of bass emphasis as well as a fair amount of lower and mid treble emphasis. The mid-range, the upper mid-range has got a little bit, you know, it's got a fair amount of pinna gain in there baked into it, but generally this is not an earphone that you would go to for the mid-range. This is an earphone that you would be attracted to for the bass. Anything else? I mean, yeah, the bass is definitely the dominant character of this, but it doesn't, in my opinion, really come at the expense of sounding muddy at all. Like, it's generally a fairly cool sounding, crystalline general tone. It's just very, very V. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about that bass. So it's a dynamic driver earphone. We already talked about that. And the reason that people generally like dynamic drivers, whether it's a single dynamic earphone or a hybrid setup, is just the character in the bass that you get is pretty different from the bass than you'll get in a balanced armature set. It's just generally is going to give you a lot more body, and I think that the FD5 definitely has got a lot of body to it. Some notes that I wrote down is I just kind of said it's got kind of a hearty wallop to the bass, which again, if you're looking for a dynamic driver earphone and you're looking for beryllium coatings, that's probably what you're expecting, and that's basically what Fiio has delivered here. I think there's no obvious, smearing from that big bass. You get a lot of bass, you don't necessarily get a lot of mud or cloudiness in the rest of the frequency response, which is good. Fairly sharp attack, pretty satisfying decay because, again, it's dynamic driver. And this was just the thing that stood out to me when I was listening to this, is that this seems like an earphone that is really tuned for bass guitar specifically. So it's maybe not so much, I mean, there is a decent amount of sub-bass emphasis to go along with that mid-bass wallop, but I think because the bass kind of rises fairly early and you get that mid-bass body to it, it really does carry through the tone and notes of a bass guitar pretty strongly. I'm gonna go ahead and skip the mids for now. We'll talk a little bit about the treble, which is probably one of the most controversial parts of the tuning here. As we saw during the frequency response graph, the lower treble, mid treble is fairly elevated here on the FD5. I mean, it keeps the sound generally sounding pretty clear, but it does give it a hint of sibilance. That was the thing that Metal3571 called out during the unboxing videos. He said it looks sibilant, and he was right. It's a little bit sibilant. I wouldn't say it's like overly sibilant, but if you are listening to music that has some sibilance baked into it, this headphone is not necessarily going to deal with it that great. But more to the point, the bigger issue that I have with the treble on here, frankly, is just that lower treble kind of gives vocals a bit of a shrillness to them, almost kind of a metallic resonance you could describe on vocals, especially, fairly bright vocals. The treble can sound a little bit on the splashy side. It's not necessarily the most fatiguing treble. In fact, I would say it's definitely not like the hottest, most fatiguing treble. And even in like the upper treble, it's not necessarily extended super well. So like it doesn't, I don't know. I generally just didn't find it especially fatiguing. It was more just a little bit irritating for me. And then I guess you can kind of imagine when you've got the elevated bass and that elevated treble, where does that leave the mid-range? And I gotta say, that's kind of where I titled this video, in with the bass and out with the, and I think it's the mids that kind of suffer. I mean, there is, some forwardness in the upper mid-range, which is fairly typical for most earphones. It's not, tuned with a warm upper mid-range, like something like an Odyssey or even like AirPods Max, right? But just basically, in between the bass and those upper mids, there's just not a lot of detail and texture left for the mid-range. I don't know. I found the mid-range, generally tonally it sounds about normal. It doesn't sound like the vocals don't get honky or overly nasally, apart from the slight metallic timbre that I mentioned that you get from that lower treble. But it's just, I don't know. For a mid-range fan like me, I find it a little bit boring, frankly. And, that means that, again, at least the way that I perceive sound, things like soundstage and imaging, I think this thing does okay, but that lack of mid-range sort of depth, again, at least the way that I hear sound, just I think overly limits the quality of that stage and imaging and stuff like that. With some complex tracks, A good example is the Cure's Disintegration album. That most of those tracks are just kind of really busy with a lot of sound kind of constantly going on. I found mid-range on the FD5 just kind of came across a little bit low resolution, frankly. I don't know, it's not a bad sounding earphone by any stretch, but it's, I think, just not really competitive at 320 bucks, in my opinion. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about some comparisons. And some of these comparisons, I'm gonna admit, like right off the bat, there's a good chance that people that are gonna like this earphone are not gonna like the JVC FD-X1, but personally, I much prefer the JVC. So now these are both single dynamic driver earphones, but that's kind of where the similarities stop. This is generally kind of a bright neutral tune. And again, this is a fairly warm, bassy tune. Just mid-range texture, detail, and general naturalness to the sound. I think the JVC just does so much better, and like the sharpness in the definition of treble is here without the sort of shrill impact on vocal tonality that you get here with the Fiio. I mean, bass is definitely stronger on the FD5 if you're looking for a bassy earphone. The FD5 will definitely do it better, but frankly, I actually really quite like the bass character of the JVC. It's just not overly bassy. Here, it's definitely a bass dominant earphone. You know, despite the fact that I said it's not muddy and it doesn't like cloud up the rest of the frequency response, it's still definitely the most obvious part of the sound. And frankly, that's part of why I actually found myself turning up the volume more than I usually would on the Fiio, just because I was trying to hear everything behind the bass, and it's there. Again, it's fairly clear. It's just you get a lot of bass for that. So now let's talk about another comparison worth making, and this earphone's even more different because, well, this is a hybrid earphone. So this is the Moondrop Cross Critical Blessing 2 Dusk. Let me pull up my notes real quick on this. I think that just in comparison, this is pretty rough on the Fiio, if I'm honest. Like, and maybe that's not a big surprise. The Blessing 2 Dusk is just an outstanding earphone for the money. Again, basically these things are priced exactly the same, but in terms of mid-range resolution and quality, I think the Blessing 2 and the Dusk especially, just, I don't know, I feel like it clobbers the FD5. And then, you know, with the original Blessing 2, you might be giving up a little bit in bass versus the FD5. But with the Dusk, which I've got here, like, you don't really give up that much. I mean, it's definitely a less bassy earphone than the FD5, but in terms of that kick that you get from the sub bass, I feel like the Dusk does it at least as well as the Fiio, maybe even a little bit tighter. Now, you don't get as much of that mid-bass kind of body to it as in the Dusk. And again, there's gonna be some people that probably will prefer the sound of the FD5, but personally, in my opinion, I would definitely take the Blessing kind of any day over the Fiio. And then the last comparison I'll make, and I'll probably keep this one pretty close, but is this versus actually the Fiio FH3, which is an earphone I've reviewed previously. I really like it. It's another of Fiio's earphones. That is, again, it's a hybrid earphone, so it's a little bit different than this, but like this, it's got a beryllium coated dynamic driver for the bass. And well, maybe the biggest difference between this earphone and the FH3 is that the FH3 costs about half as much as this. In fact, it might cost less than half as much. And if I'm honest, I would rather listen to the FH3. I think the FH3 has just got much better resolution through the mid-range, and maybe that's not what you're after. Maybe you're just after the bass, but even there, I feel like the FH3 does bass at least as well, and maybe even better than the FD5. So, I mean, that's my review of the Fiio FD5. I think it's a great looking earphone. Again, ergonomics are okay. And sound is not bad. It's just, for my personal preferences, I look for a lot more in the mid-range, and I find these a little bit lacking. So, out of 5 stars, I'm gonna go ahead and give the FD5 3 stars. Again, not a bad earphone, but I do feel like at 320 bucks, it's a bit of a tough sell given some of the competition that's already out there. So that is the Fiio FD5 if you're interested in checking this thing out. Of course, I've got links in the description down below. While you're down there, if you found this video helpful, please hit the like button because that helps me out. So kind of this little give and take sort of thing. And if you're not already, subscribe to the channel, ding the bell. YouTube will let you know next time I'm live, and then we can have a little conversation like I'm about to have with the folks that are here live. I'll check you later.